Europe, 1588. The most powerful empire on earth, Catholic Spain, prepares to unleash its invincible fleet upon a small, defiant island, Protestant England. Led by the ambitious King Philip II, the Spanish Armada was a colossal force, its mission to crush Queen Elizabeth I and reclaim England for the Catholic faith. But against this immense power, a smaller, faster English fleet, commanded by daring captains, prepared to fight for its very survival. This wasn't just a battle for dominance. It was a desperate struggle for a kingdom's soul. As the two fleets met on the high seas, the fate of nations hung in the balance, a drama of courage, cunning, and the ultimate wild card, the untamed fury of nature itself. In the late 16th century, Europe was a continent fractured by faith and dominated by a single, colossal power, the Spanish Empire. From his palace at El Escorial, King Philip II ruled over a global dominion that spanned Spain, Portugal, vast territories in the Netherlands, and a colonial empire that stretched across 2 oceans. This was an empire fueled by the gold and silver of the Americas, and protected by what was believed to be the most formidable navy the world had ever seen. Philip, a man of deep and unyielding Catholic piety, saw himself not merely as a monarch, but as God's chosen champion, tasked with defending the true faith against a tide of Protestant heresy. Across the English Channel lay a small, ambitious island kingdom led by a monarch Philip, considered a heretic, a pretender to the throne, and a constant thorn in his side, Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, had firmly established England as a Protestant nation, rejecting papal authority. Worse still in Philip's eyes, she actively supported the Protestant Dutch rebels who were fighting to break free from Spanish rule in the Netherlands. But it was her unofficial sponsorship of a new breed of privateers' men like the daring and notorious Francis Drake that pushed Philip's patience to its breaking point. These English sea dogs brazenly raided Spanish treasure fleets and colonial ports, stealing immense wealth and humiliating the Spanish crown. For years, the two nations had engaged in a cold war of sorts, but a final, unforgivable act made a full-scale confrontation inevitable. In 1587, Philip's greatest diplomatic weapon and a potential Catholic claimant to the English throne, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed by Elizabeth's order. For Philip, this was not just a political act. It was a sacrilege, a final challenge that could not go unanswered. The time for proxy wars and privateering was over. It was time for a grand, decisive invasion that would topple Elizabeth, restore England to the Catholic fold, and secure Spanish dominance forever. The preparations for this colossal undertaking were unparalleled. Philip began assembling a fleet of such immense scale and power that it was given a name reflecting its purpose and confidence: the Spanish Armada, or the Great and Most Fortunate Navy. The fleet was a marvel of 16th century naval power, consisting of over 130 ships, including towering, heavily armed galleons, nimble patrol vessels, and immense supply ships. It carried not just sailors, but an army of nearly 30,000 soldiers, priests and gentlemen volunteers, along with thousands of cannons, horses, and a massive supply of food and water to sustain a long campaign. The plan was audacious, but on paper, brilliant. The Armada would sail from Lisbon, move up the English Channel, and anchor at Calais, a port on the coast of Flanders. There, it would link up with a veteran army of 30,000 men under the command of the brilliant Duke of Parma, who was already fighting the Dutch rebels. Once the two forces had combined, they would cross the Channel, land in England, and march on London, crushing Elizabeth's forces and forcing her surrender. The mission was seen as divinely blessed, and the scale of the fleet itself seemed to guarantee victory. To the rest of Europe, and to the Spanish themselves, the Armada was indeed invincible. Yet a closer look at this seemingly perfect plan revealed cracks that would later prove catastrophic. The fleet was an assembly of different ship types from various regions of the empire, making its cohesion and speed questionable. Its commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, was a brilliant military man, but had little experience commanding a fleet at sea. And perhaps most importantly, the English fleet was of a different kind, entirely smaller, faster, and more nimble, with captains who knew their home waters and were masters of new gunnery tactics. The stage was set not just for a battle, but for a clash of different eras of naval warfare and for a confrontation that would test the very limits of human courage and ambition. As the Invincible Armada, a colossal floating city of wood and canvas, began its slow, deliberate journey up the English Channel, England was bracing for the inevitable. The English fleet, anchored at Plymouth, was a stark contrast to the Spanish. It was smaller, comprised of lighter and more agile ships, and its command was a mix of seasoned sailors and daring privateers, men who had learned their trade by raiding Spanish treasure ships. The English admiral, Lord Howard of Effingham, was a noble, but his real tactical genius came from his lieutenants, most notably Sir Francis Drake. Drake, a man famous for his raids and his circumnavigation of the globe, embodied the new, aggressive spirit of English naval power. The legend of him calmly finishing a game of bowls as the Armada was sighted perfectly captures the cool confidence of the English command. The clash of these two fleets was a clash of different eras of naval warfare. The Spanish, accustomed to centuries of land combat, planned to fight on the sea as if they were on land. Their strategy was to get as close as possible to the English ships, fire their cannons once or twice, and then grapple and board the enemy vessel, overwhelming them with their superior numbers of soldiers. Their galleons were floating castles, designed to be impregnable platforms for infantry. The English, however, had a different plan entirely. Their ships were faster and more maneuverable, designed for speed and long-range engagement. They would use their improved cannons to bombard the Spanish from a safe distance, never allowing them to close in and board. This was a battle of mobility versus might and speed versus scale. The first engagements began as the Armada sailed past Plymouth. For days, the English fleet, a pack of smaller ships, continuously harassed the Spanish. They didn't engage in a single decisive battle. Instead, they darted in and out of range, firing their cannons and chipping away at the massive Spanish formation. Lord Howard's strategy was to wear them down, to disrupt their formation, and to prevent them from landing. The Spanish, unable to catch the faster English ships, were frustrated, and their morale began to wane as their cumbersome fleet was slowly pushed up the channel. The pivotal moment of the campaign came as the Armada reached Calais on the French coast. To their dismay, the Duke of Parma's army was not yet ready to board their ships. Forced to anchor and wait, the massive Spanish fleet was dangerously vulnerable. It was here that Francis Drake and the English command unleashed their most cunning and devastating tactic. In the dead of night, they set 8 small ships on fire, loaded with flammable materials and cannons, and sent them sailing directly into the anchored Spanish fleet. The sight of the burning fireships drifting towards them in the darkness was a terrifying psychological blow. In a panic, the Spanish captains cut their anchor ropes and scattered in disarray, breaking the Armada's crescent formation that had protected it for days. The magnificent fleet was no longer an organized force, but a collection of panicked, fleeing ships. This moment of chaos led directly to the decisive engagement at the Battle of Gravelines. On the morning after the fireships, the English fleet descended on the disorganized Spanish ships. For 8 hours, they used their superior speed and gunnery to devastating effect, pummeling the Spanish galleons with long-range cannon fire. The Spanish, with no means to retaliate effectively at range and without a cohesive battle plan, were battered and bloodied. By the end of the day, their ships were severely damaged and they had suffered heavy casualties. Their mission was now an impossibility. They had been driven out of the English Channel, unable to rendezvous with Parma's army. The mighty Armada had been defeated not by a single glorious battle, but by a combination of strategic brilliance, tactical cunning, and the psychological warfare of the English command. The Battle of Gravelines was a decisive defeat for the Spanish Armada, but it was not the end of its ordeal. The battered Spanish fleet, driven out of the English Channel and unable to link up with the Duke of Parma's army, found itself in a desperate and perilous position. With their anchors lost to the Fireships, their ships damaged, and their supplies dwindling, the Spanish commanders had only one option: to abandon their mission and return to Spain. But the path home was not a simple one. The victorious English fleet had effectively blocked the channel, forcing the Armada to sail north, around the wild and treacherous coasts of Scotland and Ireland, on a journey that would prove far more deadly than any battle. This was where the Invincible fleet met its true and most unforgiving enemy, the untamed fury of nature. The late summer and autumn of 1588 brought a series of ferocious storms and gales that were unprecedented in their violence. The Spanish ships, already low on fresh water and food, and with hulls weakened by English cannon fire, were no match for the monumental waves and brutal winds of the North Atlantic. They were blown off course, driven into jagged coastlines, and scattered across hundreds of miles of unforgiving seas. The shores of Ireland became a graveyard for the Great Armada. Ship after ship, unable to steer a proper course, was smashed against the rocky coastline. The loss of life was catastrophic. Thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers, having survived the battles in the Channel, now perished in the freezing waters. Those who managed to make it to shore were often killed or taken captive by the local Irish population, who, though Catholic, were under English rule. The tragedy was immense and heartbreaking. A military defeat had been compounded by a natural disaster of unimaginable scale, transforming a failed invasion into a complete and utter catastrophe. When the remnants of the Armada finally limped back to Spain in September and October, the sight was one of utter devastation. Only about 60 of the original 130 ships returned, and of the nearly 30,000 men who had set out with such grand ambition, more than half were gone. The cost was staggering, not just in ships and men, but in morale and national pride. The once mighty Spanish Empire, still immensely powerful, had been humiliated on a world stage. But for England, the outcome was more than just a victory. It was a profound, defining moment that launched a new era. The victory over the Armada was celebrated as a miracle, a divine sign of God's favor on Queen Elizabeth I and the Protestant faith. The image of the English fleet, led by a female monarch, defeating the greatest power on earth, became a central pillar of English national identity and a source of immense pride. Elizabeth's rule was now cemented, and her legend as a strong, capable leader was secured. More significantly, the defeat of the Armada was the beginning of the end for Spanish naval dominance and the dawn of a new maritime age. The English victory was a testament to the superiority of their new naval tactics: smaller, faster ships and the power of long-range gunnery. This strategy would become the blueprint for future naval warfare and would allow England to challenge and eventually surpass Spain as a global power. The confidence gained from the Armada's defeat inspired a new wave of exploration, colonization, and commerce that would eventually lead to the creation of the British Empire. In the end, the story of the Spanish Armada is more than a tale of a single battle. It is a story of how a seemingly impossible victory, aided by the sheer fury of nature, became a pivotal turning point in world history. It was the moment when a nation on the defensive found its courage, redefined naval warfare, and set sail on a new course to become the dominant maritime force in the world for centuries to come. The grand ambition of Philip II had been humbled, and a new era of English power had begun.